With the United States of America, the land of the free, the home of the brave, still being the world's first economy and the most dynamic capital market in the world, is it absolutely necessary to have a U.S. green card or to be a U.S. citizen to access the U.S. market? You know what? Not really. Let's take a closer look at the alternatives. Hello everyone, my name is Javier Correa and I'm a Research and Development Associate here at Nomad Capitalist, where we help 7- and 8-figure entrepreneurs go where they're treated best, maximize the return on their investment by minimizing their taxes, and just overall improve their lifestyles and their quality of life. Now, today we're going to be talking about the United States, and this is actually a very, I would say, peculiar video. As you know, most of our videos talk about countries in Europe or potentially some emerging economies in Southeast Asia or Latin America, but the United States is pretty much still on our radar, but not for the reasons you might think. While we do believe that becoming a tax resident of the United States might not be fully beneficial for any global entrepreneur or investor, given the fact that the U.S. has some of the most aggressive controlled foreign corporation rules, has some of the most aggressive worldwide taxation rules. If you happen to become a United States citizen, then obviously U.S. tax rules and obligations will follow you no matter where you go. Once you become a citizen or a green card holder under certain circumstances, what we call a long-term green card holder, if you want to exit the system, you will be faced with exit taxes. So, all of these things remain true. And as I was saying before, just because we believe and we would recommend that it is not ideal for somebody to become a tax resident of the United States, that doesn't mean that investing in the US is necessarily a bad idea. An S&P 500 index fund is still a pretty safe investment. The U.S. has some of the largest publicly traded companies in the world. U.S. real estate, while you might not get the same incredible yields you might get in emerging markets, is still a relatively safe place to park your money. And you know what? If you're looking for a loan or a credit card, then the U.S. is still a pretty competitive place to do that. Now, with all of this in mind, let's go deep into the matter of today's video, which is, do I really need to have a U.S. green card or be a U.S. citizen to actually access the positive aspects that the U.S. economy and the U.S. capital markets can offer? And you know what? The answer is no. The immediate thing I want to say, it is no. You absolutely do not have to be a green card holder or a U.S. citizen to access U.S. banking, U.S. credit, or U.S. investments. Let's take a look at some of the alternatives that might be available, and I want to highlight one in particular, and that is the E2 non-immigrant investor visa. The E2 non-immigrant investor visa, as the name indicates, is a visa for non-immigrants, meaning that an E2 visa holder will not be considered a permanent resident of the United States. In fact, the status of the E2 visa for investors is similar to the status that a tourist would have having a B1, B2 visa, meaning that you are able to enter the United States, but you are not considered a U.S. person for tax purposes. You will still be considered a non-resident alien for tax purposes unless you meet the requirements of what we call the substantial presence test. So as a small review, what is the substantial presence test? The substantial presence test is the third way in which you can become a U.S. person for tax purposes, and it applies to anyone who is not a citizen and who is not a green card holder. This test essentially looks at the last 3 years, and it tries to, or it actually doesn't try to, it determines your average stay in the U.S. over the past 3 years by calculating 1/6 of the days you were present in the United States 2 years ago, 1/3 of the days you were present in the United States the previous year, and the full amount of days you were in the United States in the current year. In addition to that, you do have to be present in the United States for over 31 days in the current calendar year to also be considered a tax resident under the substantial presence test rules. So as you can see, when you're a non-resident alien investor and you hold a non-immigrant visa that allows you to come and go to the US as you please, then the only thing you really have to be careful of is how many days you are spending in the United States. In fact, the US could even be part of your trifecta method if you really wanted to spend substantial time there. I know, for example, many people, being Latin American myself, who love spending 90 days, 60 days per year in Miami, Florida, for example. I also know some clients of ours who have told us, listen, I love going to New York, I love going to Las Vegas from time to time. And you know what? That's perfectly fine, provided that you do it as a non-resident alien and that you're keeping track of the days that you're spending there. The United States, in the case of non-resident aliens, unlike other countries does not track the ties you have in the US. That means you could potentially have a home, you can have businesses, you can have credit cards, you can have bank accounts, and that will not necessarily make you a resident for tax purposes. Going back to the advantages of the E2 visa. So obviously I stated before that in terms of immigration, you're going to have a similar status if you have an E2 investor visa than if you have a B1, B2 tourist visa. Now, while this is globally true, there are some differences which really make having the E2 visa much more competitive. So number one, E2 visa holders can request a social security number in the United States. You heard that right. As an E2 visa investor, you will have the right to a US social security number. Now, obviously with a B1, B2 visa, you could also request an ITIN, which more or less serves as the equivalent for credit score purposes, credit purposes, but with the social security number, obviously you are going one step further. You are allowed to actually perform work duties in the United States. Now, as the E2 visa holder, your work duties have to be confined to the business you're actually starting in the US, and we'll get to that in a minute, because to actually be able to apply for this visa, you need to start a business in the United States. Now, not nearly as big as some of you may think, but a business still has to be operational on the ground in the US, and you will be therefore allowed to perform work duties for that specific business. However, your spouse, if you have a dependent spouse coming with you, will also be issued a social security number, and she or he will be able to work basically for anyone in the United States. So that does give you some flexibility there. If you want to work for a period of time and then return to your home country, it's always a good option to have. Not only do you get issued a social security number, but every time you enter the United States, you are given an I-94 for 2 years at a time. The I-94 is basically the permission that you have as a non-immigrant to remain legally in the United States. So for example, when you enter on your ESTA, if you have a European passport, for example, let's say you are an Austrian citizen and you travel to Miami, Florida, and you enter at the airport, you are usually given 90 days at a time when you enter with ESTA. However, if you enter with a B1, B2 visa, let's say you are a Colombian or a Malaysian or whatever other nationality, and you travel to the US on a B1, B2 visa, usually you get an I-94 number for 6 months, meaning you can stay legally in the US for up to 6 months. Now, in the case of the E2 visa, you can stay in the US for up to 2 years legally before you have to exit the country and come back in. Now, obviously, having the option to stay in the US for that long, if it's for a specific business purpose, is great. However, do keep in mind what I was telling you before. If you're an E2 visa holder, you have the possibility of having all of these advantages and yet still being a non-resident alien for tax purposes, provided that you do not meet the substantial presence test. I told you about the calculations before. Now, what is the final result? The final result is, if the calculation I talked about before, 1/6 of the days 2 years prior, 1/3 of the days in the previous year, and the full amount of days in the current year, add up to an average of 183 days or more of presence in the US, then you are a tax resident in the United States. So if you're an E2 visa holder, you fly into Miami, Florida, for example, or into Houston, Texas, and you stay in the US for your full 2 years, the full 2 years that immigration authorities will allow you to stay there, then you will become a US person for tax purposes, just as a green card holder would and just as a US citizen would. However, and here is another big difference that I believe is worth highlighting in favor of the E2, if you decide to simply exit the US, let's say you have a specific mission. You want to go to the US to build up that business, to build up the client base, and then you are willing to exit the US and then perform your work duties from the Bahamas, the Cayman Islands, or maybe you have a team established somewhere around the world that can continue on the work duties once the heavy lifting, the initial heavy lifting is done. Then the good thing is, guess what? No exit tax for E2 visa holders. No exit tax for non-resident alien investors who might become tax residents by virtue of the substantial presence test. That means you can build up a business in the US, you can build up a clientele in the US, you can perform some strategic duties in the US, bite the bullet for 1 or 2 years, and then you can exit the system with no exit tax, and your business can go on. This is an extremely valuable advantage that long-term green card holders and US citizens do not have. So again, things worth considering. When it comes to the investment, now, obviously this is an investor visa, so what kind of investment are we talking about? Now, US immigration authorities haven't set out a specific amount, but we do know that in order for an E2 visa to be approved, the investment has to be substantial and it has to be enough for the type of business you're starting to be sustained and to be profitable in terms of a business model projection. So what does this mean? If you're going to start an auto factory, right, you want to run the next Tesla, for example, then obviously the investment level that immigration authorities will want to see will be much higher than if you just want to start a food truck. Right? Now, the good thing here is the E2 visa is available whether you want to start the next Tesla and you want to build a super gigafactory in Texas, or if you just want, to have an Arepa food truck in Brickell, Miami. Both businesses can qualify for the E2 visa. Now, usually the sweet spot for immigration authorities is around $100,000 to $120,000. We've had clients that have invested well over that. We've had clients that have invested even slightly beneath that, and provided that the amount invested is coherent with the business and provided that there is a projection that at least some jobs will be created in the US. It doesn't have to be that many. As long as you're creating 5, 6 jobs, that's pretty good. And provided that you are actually running a legitimate business. This is also very important. You can't just start an LLC and put some capital in there. No, it has to actually be a business. It has to actually have employees. It has to actually service third parties in the United States, and it has to actually contribute to the US economy. So simply starting a company and putting some money in the bank, or starting a company and buying a property, that's not going to be enough. If you're, for example, into real estate, there are ways to basically structure that. So we could look into, for example, having an LLC and then having that LLC be a property management company. In that case, of course, you're going to have the capital you're putting into the properties, but the important thing is the work you're performing as a property management company. So there are always creative ways in which you can present your project to increase the likelihood of being approved for the E2 visa. With all this in mind, it is important to also consider that not all citizens of the world can qualify for the E2 visa. In order to be eligible to apply for an E2 visa in the first place, you have to have a citizenship from a country that has signed some specific treaties with the United States, and therefore, for example, not all citizens can just directly apply. Some citizens are just ineligible from the get-go to apply for the E2 visa. However, if you are, let's say, in the UK, if you are in France, if you are in most European countries at this point, you are eligible for that E2 visa. And in fact, let me correct something right there. It's not the fact that you are in those countries, it's the fact that you are a citizen of those countries. So let's say that you are in Malaysia or you're in Dubai, but you happen to get that German passport by descent. You happen to get that Italian passport by descent. That could make you eligible for the E2 visa. It used to be much easier through the citizenship by investment path. It isn't that as easy today, but it is still theoretically possible, with a couple of more obstacles to surpass, but it is still theoretically possible to get a Grenadian passport by investment, to get a Turkish passport by investment, which we help clients obtain all the time, and then become eligible for an E2 visa. Now, the difference is, starting in 2022, if memory serves, once you purchase a passport or citizenship by investment in the case of Turkey or Grenada, now the US government actually requests that you be domiciled in those countries for a period of 3 years before you can actually apply and become eligible for the E2 visa. If you get a passport by descent or by any other means that is not related to investment, then you're good to go. On the day you get the passport, you can essentially apply for the non-immigrant visa to the US, in this case, the E2 visa. Does domicile mean I absolutely have to live in either Turkey or Grenada? Yes and no. Domicile, if you refer to some of my videos on the non-dom regime countries, you'll notice it is a pretty tricky concept. So domicile can be very subjective. It is defined as the center of vital interest. Only living in that country doesn't necessarily qualify you as being domicile, and that's actually the whole point when you look at being non-dom in a country like Ireland or Malta or Cyprus, for instance. In this case, domicile, we've spoken to several experts and attorneys on the matter. Domicile would more or less be equivalent of spending around 60 to 90 days per year in the country at least, but it is important that ties be established. So having a home in that country, having bank accounts, club memberships, if you are on the board of any charity in that country, that is also very valuable. If your religious and political life is essentially centered around those countries, that is also very important. And all of these and a lot more are elements that are taken into consideration to determine whether or not you were actually domiciled in those countries for 3 years. It's not a question of simply physically being there for 183 days or what have you. Now, it is important that you do keep in mind that as a non-resident alien investor, you will always be subject to U.S. taxes on U.S. source income. This means that as an E-2 visa holder, if you're coming and going, and if you're performing most of your work duties outside the U.S., and you are essentially taking advantage of being able to have this higher level of access to the U.S., but not becoming a U.S. person for tax purposes, you will still be subject to U.S. taxation on U.S. source income. That means U.S. issued dividends, in many cases U.S. interest, although there's an interesting hole there that would allow you to earn that interest tax-free, but that's a subject for another video. But overall, what I want everyone to be very aware of is the fact that you have a non-immigrant visa does not entirely exempt you from U.S. tax. It just means that if you do things correctly, you only have to worry about U.S. tax on U.S. source income as a non-resident alien, and that is that. So there you have it, folks. One great visa, one secret hack that you could use to enjoy the great credit and investment and business building opportunities that the U.S. may offer you without integrating fully into the U.S. tax net via a green card or through naturalization and becoming a U.S. citizen. So if you want to build a global investment portfolio, if you want options all over the world, including in the United States, then be sure to subscribe to this YouTube channel, follow us on Instagram, and no matter where you want to invest and grow your business and be exposed to, I will see you in the next video.